The main portion of today's lesson is going to come from 1 Samuel chapter 11, and we're going to take a look at a pivotal and really kind of turbulent time in Israel's history where they're transitioning from one point to another, and it's going to be a major shift. And we're going to be taking a look at from when they kind of go from the era of the judges and they get what they ask for, and it's a king over themselves. And I don't necessarily think it was a bad thing that they asked for a king, because when you go back to the book of Deuteronomy, it actually says that God tells the people at one point they're going to ask for a king. The thing I think they had a shortcoming on is they had a little bit of a comma instead of a period. They indeed wanted a king, comma, like the other nations. And like I said, that's going to be a little bit of our focal point on that today, is taking a look at that king and some of the things that were going on there that really proved himself to the people. And of course, like I said, it is a transition point in Israel's history. And when I think of that text, I'm also reminded of Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And of course, perhaps the most famous words people recognize in Ecclesiastes come from chapter 3, where it says, "Everything has its time, to everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under the sun, and of course, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to pluck what is planted, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to break down and a time to build up." And of course, there's probably about another 8 or 9 stanzas, but you get the gist of it. The fact that there are times of transition, that there are seasons that we will experience during our growth. And as I said earlier, we're just going to take a look at that point in Israel's history. And one of the things I had asked, I have taught this twice recently, one in a church in Oklahoma, and I taught this similar one in a church in Fort Smith, Arkansas. But one of the things that I asked was, when it comes to famous figures in American history, when it comes to, say, the presidents of the United States, outside of recency bias, in other words, people perhaps that we've lived through certain administrations, like right now we're under the Trump, we just got out of Biden, Trump before that. I was born, I think, during the Bush era, and after that, Clinton, then Bush Jr. So, again, outside of recency bias, when it comes to United States presidents, who comes to mind? And it's funny when I said that because, obviously the very first one of the United States presidents we had was George Washington. And for me, that's pretty easy to remember. He was our very first president. When I was a kid, I'd had dollar bills and quarters, and, here we are 30 years later, and it still seems to be the case. But we remember him because he was the inaugural. He was kind of the first. And then, of course, whenever I asked that, another congregation, like I said, they replied with Abraham Lincoln. Well, he too was our president. He was our national leader during a very tumultuous, very turbulent time during the Civil War. And of course, the fact that he was assassinated is almost another, landmark in history, a kind of a mile marker for another reason for us to remember him. And so when I asked that, I then pivoted and asked, what about when it comes to kings of Israel? Who are some of the first that come to mind? And the very first answer was David, which was hilarious because less than 2 minutes ago I had gotten done talking about Saul for a handful of minutes. But I think it proves the biblical text in some ways when it talks about Saul having his jealousies, Saul having his throwdowns, because it talks about how they went on this military campaign, and of course Saul has killed thousands. But David has killed tens of thousands, and there was this fever, there was this fervor that was already setting in with the people, to where they were wanting to take and kind of cast their eyes towards David, and Saul was kind of left in the dust. And here's the thing, Saul started off very well. He started off with a person with absolute humility. He didn't want to be recognized by the people necessarily. He didn't want to be the forefront of people. But he went a little left to being right, and as the future went on, he became less of a godly person. As a matter of fact, instead of being who God called him to be, we find later on that he starts emulating a spiritual person instead of being the spiritual person that God had called him to be. And that, of course, is when I'm talking about the sacrifices. And I'll be straight up honest with you. When it comes to the character here of King Saul, he is the very first character. This is the very first bit of text that really had me studying the intertestament relationship between the New Testament, the Hebrew Scriptures, and what we have in the Greek New Testament. And why would that be? Well, because in the Old Testament, you have this guy named Saul, who obviously is king, who began pursuing the life of David when he was a friend, when he was an ally, and when he was after the heart of God. You go to the New Testament, and there is another man by the name of Saul who is trying to extinguish the lifelight and lamp of one who is known as the Son of David. And of course, in the Old Testament, you have that Saul who he started off really well, and his ending was probably about as biblically tragic as you can get. Whereas you take a look at the Saul in the New Testament, and while nobody could accuse him of lacking zeal. He started off rough in the introduction, wanting to dismiss, he wanted to put an end to anybody who was talking about the way of the way, but we find him ending really, really good. Really, really well. And so whenever we take a look at 1 Samuel chapter 11, I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about his coronation. And let's go ahead and go back to 1 Samuel 10, verse 25. Samuel then again explained to the people the behavior of royalty, and wrote it in the book and laid it up before the Lord. And Samuel sent all of the people away, every man to his house. And Saul also went home to Gibeah, and valiant men were with him whose hearts God had touched. But some of the rebels had said, "How can this man save us?" So they despised him and brought him no presents. They didn't pay him any type of homage, but he, being Saul, held his peace. So while many of the people wanted a king, not everybody was absolutely thrilled and delighted with what the choice was. And remember how I had mentioned earlier about how Israel had asked or requested of a king like other nations? Did you ever take into consideration what Saul's name means? Shaul in Hebrew means asked or requested of. And so they asked and requested for a king, and they actually got somebody whose name means asked or requested of. And it's interesting, note too, that when you find the name Shaul, the identical spelling of his name in the Hebrew, you're not adding letters, you're not taking away any letters, you're not even rearranging them. It's the identical same sequence. Shaul could also be pronounced as Sheol, which means in English grave. It's also translated in some translations as hell. How often is it that some of the things that we ask of, some of the things that we request, really we have to have it. We need it. It's just something that it has to be an integrated part of ourselves. How often is it that the things we ask for actually don't elevate us? Instead, they bring us closer to the grave. They kind of bring hell upon our lives. And we see that Israel, they wanted a king. They requested of a king. But we find his demeanor after a time, instead of pursuing godly character, his whole character decides that he is going to try to put somebody in the grave, that he is going to be a hell to an anointed one's life. And let that just serve as a fair warning to us in the same capacity, really in the same way. Whatever you're asking of, make sure it is of godly origin and of godly content, and you place that and ask it to be blessed in the hands of God. So moving forward, I want us to take a look at, again, 1 Samuel chapter 11. And I mentioned earlier about the whole thing about the United States presidents. Why is it we remember certain ones in particular over others? Obviously, as I said in the case of George Washington, he was the inaugural president. He's on the most perhaps common denominational bill that you will find amongst the U.S. So it's kind of the same thing with Lincoln. He's on the $5 bill. He's on the next step up. You find him on pennies, of course, that he was assassinated. But you have reasons to remember one over some of the others. When it comes to the nation of Israel, what really truly put King David on the map on the eyes of everybody? And here's the thing, you don't even have to be somebody who is, been faithful since you were knee high to a grasshopper all the way through time to remember what David was probably most famous for. The whole episode with Goliath. He has this battle and taking down this giant. And as I've said before, you don't even have to be somebody who's been faithful since you were a child in church to know that story. That's one that is known in the secular world perhaps more than anything else. But what about the battle that Saul had that solidified him as king in the eyes of all Israel? And here's the thing. You get crickets when you ask that question because it's not something that is very well known. It's not as known as David and Goliath. Even people who've been faithful through the years in the church, a lot of them draw blanks on this, and that's what 1 Samuel 11 is. It was Saul's first test as king, and this is really what proved his worth to the eyes of the nation. And I'm going to read to you the first, let's go 3 verses of this chapter. The Nahash the Ammonite came up and encamped against Jabesh Gilead, and all the people of Jabesh said to Nahash, "Make a covenant with us, and we will serve you." And Nahash the Ammonite answered them, "On this condition I will make a covenant with you, that I may put out all of your right eyes and bring reproach on all of Israel." Then the elders of Jabesh said to him, "Hold off 7 days, that we may send messengers to all of the territory of Israel, and then, if there's no one to serve us, we will come out to you." So here's an interesting thing. Why is it that he would ask them to take out their right eyes? And here's the thing. As I was preaching this last Sunday at Homestead in Fort Smith, Arkansas, I had asked the people, what is the point of having these people gauge out their right eyes? What's the deal? Well, number one, if you're looking at a crowd and you see majority of the people or an X amount of the people missing an eye, number one, that's very quick identification. And in a situation like this, you would actually have immediately known and available mental stock of these people. They didn't fight for their freedoms. It wasn't important enough for them to even attempt to put up a fight, so they would be instantly recognizable amongst all the rest. Number two, if they went to a point in time where they would decide that they were going to revolt and they were going to maybe attempt to salvage some aspect or some essence of freedom, how effective were they going to be in their revolt? Because after all, if you take out one of their eyes, you're going to really truly mess with their depth perception. And so it's going to help make really their defense. You're handicapping the people. And he's doing it for a purpose. He's doing it for a reason. If you have no depth perception, the Benjaminites, a lot of them talks about how you find other characters in scripture about how they could use one of those bean flips, where they could use one of the slingshots. Yeah, if you've only got one eye, you don't have that depth perception advantage. And so you help create ineffective or lesser effective fighters. So when a point in time comes, if you push them over the brink, they're going to have to remain subjugates. They're not going to be able to fight for their freedoms. And so you have this guy, this man named Nahash, who's asking these people to immediately compromise their God-given vision, to make it only half as effective, perhaps, as it was before. And here's something interesting, at least in my eyes, to me. This is the very first time we ever come across the name Nahash in the Bible. That being said, it's not the first time we come across the word Nahash. And the reason I mention this is because we find Nahash pretty much all the way back in the beginning of the beginning. What does Nahash mean? You don't have to go any further than Genesis chapter 3 before you encounter this ancient enemy. As a matter of fact, if you go back to Genesis chapter 3, it says that Nahash was more cunning than any animal of the field. So what does Nahash mean? Nahash, or Nachash, literally means serpent or snake. And how interesting, how striking is it that the very first opposition that Adam and Eve would face would be a serpent? And how telling is it that the very first king of Israel, the very first thing he had to prove himself as a leader of the nation in this sequence is none other by somebody who is named after that serpent. And you could think about all the different things that that could potentially mean. Again, compromise? Yeah, absolutely. The serpent in itself was a bit nefarious in its intentions, just like Nahash of 1 Samuel chapter 11. It's bringing derisiveness. It's bringing division. It's questioning, do you have enough? Do you know enough? And part of the purpose of its presence is bringing that separation, bringing that division. And as I said, remember earlier, as I mentioned, this is a time of turbulence in Israel's history, of their existence as a nation. Why? Because they're going from one form of leadership, and they've developed now into something different. And of course, it's right at that time where Israel's going through this transition point, questioning and learning the reality of what their new reality is, that the enemy comes, rears his head, and is asking a particular amount of people to compromise their vision. And remember, if there is a vision that God has given you, there is going to be an attempt to squelch that vision and make it something lesser than. And here's the thing, there's some of the questions that the serpent back in Genesis asked Adam, and really Adam, asked Eve, that I think maybe we should ask ourselves. But here's the thing, when it's outside sources asking us these particular questions, for what purpose are they doing that? In a lot of cases, it's not to build us up. It's actually to, like I said earlier, have nefarious purposes. And so allow us to take a look at that. And so what was the answer? What was the outgoing of this? So the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and told the news in the hearing of the people. And all of the people lifted up their voices and wept. And there was Saul coming behind the herd of the field, and Saul said, "What troubles the people that they weep?" And they told him the words of the men of Jabesh. Then the Spirit of God came upon Saul when he had heard the news, and his anger was greatly aroused. He took a yoke of oxen and cut them into pieces, and sent them throughout all the territory of Israel by the hands of the messengers, saying, "Whoever does not go out with Saul and Samuel to battle, so it shall be done to them as this oxen." Then the fear of the Lord fell upon the people, and they came out with one consent. You ever heard of united we stand, divided we fall? Here's the thing about these oxen. They would go through, they would help break up the soil, they would really break up this Adamah, and it would really expose what was underneath. You do realize that Adam, man, comes from Adamah, the earth. If we are allowing ourselves to be divided, if we are allowing ourselves this compromise and allowing ourselves to be disconnected, disjointed, that life that's inside of us that's helped bring up and tear up this Adamah, this thing in Adam, we don't have a hope. And that's what he's dismissing. This is what he is showcasing to the people. So when he numbered them in Bezek, the children of Israel, 300,000, and the men of Judah, 30,000. And they said to the messengers who come, "Thus shall you say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, tomorrow by the time the sun is hot, you shall have help." Then the messengers came and reported it to the men of Jabesh, and they were glad. Therefore the men of Jabesh said, "Tomorrow we will come out to you, and you may do with us whatever seems good." So it was on the next day that Saul put the people in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch and killed Ammonites until the heat of the day. And so it happened that those who survived and were scattered, that no two of them were left together. Then the people said to Samuel, "Who is he who said, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Bring the men that we may put them to death." And remember, not everybody was thrilled with the choice of Saul becoming king. And these people, right after this proving point, after these stomping grounds, what do they say? Bring them up. We've already proven them being wrong. But what did Saul say? "Not a man shall be put to death this day, for the Lord has accomplished Yeshua." He has accomplished salvation in Israel. And of course, what is Jesus' name? It means salvation. It's Yeshua. Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there." At this point in time, obviously, we all know that Saul is the anointed one of God. And he didn't allow his perception to the people, whether it be right, whether it be wrong, wrong turned into right, corrected. It didn't matter. He dismissed this ego of himself, and he let the people recognize it's fine, it's okay. And I feel sometimes whenever we see these points of transition, these times of transition, when there's new leaderships come upon us, whether it be work, whether it be in a church, there's a lot of people who come in, as I mentioned earlier, with a lot of fervor and a lot of fever, and they have really good ambitions. They have these really excellent ideas. We have to remember to keep our eyes on the prize, and we have to be able to see the Son of Man as he was lifted up, that our eyes are to be drawn to him, not the people that we would physically see who are helping guide those thoughts, helping guide that vision. And there are times to where, like Saul, they start off good, they're excellent, they're well-intentioned, and they're very clearly and obviously anointed. But as we see in the life of Saul, as time goes on, he becomes a little left to being right, and he becomes almost a mad king. And I view kings like this. They are a visual representation, a physical representation of God's authority among the people. And even Samuel in the chapter prior said, look, they're a man. They're going to want some worldly things. They're going to have worldly desires. They're going to want their own chariots, their armies, so on and so forth. Do not be surprised when this happens. But Samuel from God tells the people, whether you have a king or you don't have a king, your hearts belong to God, and you have to answer as a nation. Whether you've got a good king, somebody who's righteous, or whether they're wicked, it is still on you, the people. And it is still the purpose, the aim, and the intentions of a congregation for their hearts not to lie in the hands of the pastor as the end-all be-all, the one where the buck stops. It's not the case. Their hearts, their hopes, their spirits and souls need to be set on the heartbeat of heaven, and that is Christ. That is something that we will aim for. And so that's one of the things that I want to mention too, is like I said, a lot of pastors start off with really good intentions. And I will quote the words of what my pastor in the ministry told me, what Don Hall told me. And it was this, excuse me. He said he felt his job as a pastor, his goal and his aim was this: that he could help a person relate so deeply to the heart of Christ and get them in tune with God and the Lord so well that he was no longer necessary. He was only effective as a pastor as he could help them relate to Christ, where he didn't need to be around anymore. And I know for a lot of people that's a hard pill to swallow. And he said, that's the thing. I'm here for the fellowship. He said, I want to be around the people. But he's like, I want to train and develop them to where they don't have to rely on me to hear from him. And I really feel that that's the case of what we find in a lot of the kings of Israel. That was the real truth about David, was he was helping develop individuals. He was about helping develop people. And like I said, he was a man, he had flesh, he had shortcomings, and we all understand that. But whenever we read 1 Samuel chapter 11, let us remember that if we are anointed and appointed by God for something, there will be opposition that will come. And let us not be surprised that it may take the form in one shape or another as the most ancient of enemies. That there is going to be questioning, that there is going to be elements of temptation. And the only tool and the only weapon that this enemy has is his mouth. Think about Christ when he was making his transition from an ordinary, quote unquote, mundane life, even though it was anything but he was entering into the realm of public ministry. One of the things he had to go through was an era of temptation after the 40 days. So if it was something in some way, shape, or form that Adam and Eve had to face and fight, something the very first king of Israel had to go through, and that our King of Kings had to endure, take the faith, hold firm, and like Christ, be able to know Scripture well enough to reveal the heart of God. Thank you for your time. Be blessed.